before going into Photoshop to explain the retouching workflow, I've made a couple of small changes to the lighting in the scene in terms of the V-Ray lights, so I'll just let you be aware of that. I've gone in and selected this spherical light on the side here and turned this to a red light so that it catches more of a stronger red reflection. Sorry, it's just auto-saving. And I've just rotated these. Sorry, I'll just go from perspective viewport. I've rotated the cylindrical lights here just a little bit more to the left. Before they were just a little bit over, so I've just rotated those 5 degrees over here, just so they're catching a little bit more front on, so that the rim lighting is a bit more separate. So you can see the two distinct kind of lines of light reflecting in this area. Okay, so what I've got here is, before I save off the render passes to utilize in Photoshop, I've gone and rendered things, and there's a couple of things I need to explain before I bring everything into Photoshop. And one of those is you'll notice up the top here, the visor doesn't look that great. So when you are rendering off your final image in the print industry, you'll often rely on rendering certain elements with different lighting so that they catch their most ideal reflections. What I mean by that is you can see that the reflections we've got lighting the main character itself look good, and there's a really nice base to work with there in terms of where to retouch from. But when it comes to the visor, because it's a lot more reflective than everything else in the scene, and the shape of the visor is quite specific, you need to go in and make sure the lights react to the visor in the most ideal way, so you're catching the shape and highlights of the model itself. So I'll bring the render passes into Photoshop and then show you what I mean by that by going back into HDR Light Studio and breaking down how to just relight one area, and you do a small region render over that area, and then you can composite the two together in Photoshop using a mask of the light of the visor itself. The other thing to take note of is I need to show you how to separate the bloom and glare from the lighting pass so that you can work with it in a composite layer. So if I go to the bloom effect here, you'll see the settings I've got set up. They're totally up to you in terms of how dense you want things to go, but I'll do a re-render here so that the bloom shows up. So this render doesn't have the bloom enabled right now, but it's important to realize that to get the glare looking good, I've gone in and created a separate halo, which, if you can see here, looks like so. And I'll just put a gamma correction on this so you can see a little bit more how it comes out. And this is going to show up in the highlights. So I've made sure to get the hexagonal streaks coming out of here and the rainbow like halo effect. So I'll re-render and you'll see that stuff pop up, and then I'll explain to you how I'm going to separate the two in Photoshop, which I only just learned recently off of the CalScript forums. So you can see with the lens effect turned on, we're getting a really nice big glow around the more intense objects. And if you'd see the difference between the source render and the glow render, you get a lot more realism coming off the lights and off the intense highlights. Now the problem is there's some areas here where it's probably too intense. So that's where I need to take things into Photoshop and separate the two. So it's important to realize that when you have the lens effect turned on, you need to set the mode to show up in the image and the render element. You can see it's just reapplying both of those. So when you go into the render passes, you've got the lens effect source. So what I'm going to do from this point is, before I bring things into Photoshop, is I'm going to re-render the project at high res. So I'm going to take the resolution from 2000 to 3000 wide by 4000 high. I'm going to double check the settings one more time. I'm actually pretty happy with those. And as I increase the resolution, I'm going to require less AA in the scene. So you can see, because the character has so much texture detail, I'm relying heavily on anti-aliasing to clean things, and in the scene subdivisions, everything's quite low. Because those passes, like the global illumination, as you can see, are not affecting the scene very much. And the texturing itself is where you need those samples anyway. So like I said, I'm going to re-render things, and I'm going to bring in the passes into Photoshop, and we'll get started working through a quick kind of breakdown of what I did to achieve the end result in the project. So the render's finished. I'm just going to start bringing in the render elements that I've saved off from the final render, and we can get started retouching it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the raw beauty pass, like you can see here. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the bloomed version. So now you can see this is the raw render without any bloom and glare. So this is the lens effect source pass. And then over the top here, we've got the beauty pass with all the glows and things like that on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the bloomed version over the top of the beauty render, and to extract the bloom and glare from that, I'm going to set the mode to difference, and you can see what that leaves us with is just the highlights coming off the bloom and glare passes. Taking in note that the bloom is affected by the color of the reflection, which is where that realism and benefit of using it inside of V-Ray comes from. So what I can do here is I'm going to collapse this render and just copy the layer. So I'm going to undo that collapsing. Now what I can do is I can delete the bloomed layer and paste the solo effects over the top themselves. And now if I set this to linear dodge, I get back the exact same render that's come out of V-Ray with the passes over the top, except this time I've got control over how intense I want to make the highlights. So you can see here, if I put an exposure pass on and hit Control-Alt-G to link that exposure layer to the bloom and glare, now I can control those effects separate from the beauty pass, which is extremely important when trying to narrow in how dense you want those effects to be, because there's some areas where you want to reduce the effect, and then there's other areas where you want to increase the effect. Now on top of that, I've also got the option now to put a mask on that bloom layer, and I can paint in where I want that bloom to go. So you can see up here near the eyes and things like that, if I want to paint away that glare, and I'm not using my tablet for this, I'm just using my mouse, and I've got a large soft brush, I can just paint away so that the glare isn't overbearing on the edges. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go back into my render layers, and I just want to bring in the alpha pass. Now remember, what you're about to see here, I was a little bit hesitant to show and explain to you because I'm not really a retoucher. So you'll see that what I'm doing is quite destructive, and at the end of the day, the course was designed to teach you V-Ray and not Photoshop. So take it with a grain of salt, because when Milton does his retouching course, you'll see that he does things completely different to me in a non-destructive way. And the difference between myself and Milton is he's doing things in a way where if a client is asking you to make changes, you haven't destroyed the image in the process. Whereas what I'm doing is I'm treating it more like a personal project and just heading in one direction as I'm retouching the image to get it to that final quality, because I know there's no client that's going to be coming back and requesting major changes at different points in time. So for the guys who are going to be relying on what I'm showing you here in production, I probably wouldn't take too much from what I'm about to show you. But for the guys who are just doing personal work and want to give their renders that little bit extra kick and get things to that final quality, it's worth taking note of. So I'm going to bring the alpha pass in, and you can see when I've done that, it's just linked it. So I'm going to undo that. So I'm going to copy this layer, Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the background layer and double click that, and you'll see that just gets rid of that background option that was there, so it's not locked anymore. And I'm just going to duplicate the layer. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply an alpha to that layer. I'm going to go into the channel, and now you can see that there's the layer mask inside of there. I'm going to make that visible, and I'm going to paste that alpha back in. So now on that layer, we've got a duplicated version of the beauty pass separate from the background. And what this lets us do is it lets us control click that layer in case at any point in time I need to go in and make an alpha or a selection of the character. But it also gives us the ability to darken off the background, and you can see here if I create a new layer underneath that, and I can just fill that in with a black layer, and then basically I can use this to, you know, darken off and reduce the effect of the background we're seeing here. But also I can do other more tricky things. So I can make this layer 100%, and I can put an alpha on that layer, and now if I have a big enough texture, I can kind of paint away and create a natural vignette around the character. So now if I fade off that layer, I've got a complete custom ability to, you know, make it look how I want. I'm going to go into the alpha pass, and I'm just going to go hover over the light here, and I'm going to make this black. I'm going to go into the bloom pass, and I'm just going to delete this light here. You can see that's there because I haven't actually removed the light from showing up as an alpha. So it's rendered in the beauty pass, and I'll always end up painting that out anyway, but I'm just going to try and clean up the file a little bit in this starting process. So I'm just getting rid of those other layers in Photoshop, just because in the new versions of Photoshop, the more files you have up, the more it's going to save to the scratch disks, and it kind of creates backups nowadays. So if I'm not if I'm not utilizing pass inside of Photoshop, I'll just close things down. So now over the top of everything, I'm going to brighten up the fingertips here. So I'm going to put an exposure layer over the top of the image, and actually before I do that, I'm going to control select the character, so the exposure is only affecting the inside and not the background. So this is where I'll just go in, like I said, and what I can do now is I can brighten this up, and you can see as I'm brightening it up, we're getting a bit more of a gradient inside the fingertips and livening those up a bit. So without that, they're looking a bit flat. If I zoom in here, when I put that on, the gradient shows up and things start to look a little bit more hot. I'm also going to darken that down on the gamma correction. But you can see what this has done is it's affected everything on the character, whereas I only want that to show up on the fingertips themselves. So I'm going to make a rectangular selection around the fingers, and I'm going to invert that selection, so I've only got the fingertips selected, and I'm just going to fill that with black. So now you can see what I've done is we're only brightening up the fingertips. So now I'm going to click the alpha for that layer, and this is where I'll just paint away where I don't want those to be affected. I'm only trying to affect the fingertips in that area. So now I need to fix up the coloring of those areas. You can see they're a little bit too red. So I'm going to put another selection over the top of the character itself. I'm going to add a hue and saturation layer, and this time I'm just playing with, you can see as I go more towards the right on the hue adjustment, we get a little bit more of that heat coming through. And very subtle differences, you know, even just setting it to 1 there, and if I zoom in 32-bit has an effect. So I'm going to set this to 2. And you can see that effect coming through. I'm going to go to the red and maybe just put this up. You can see that how that's affected the whole character itself. So now what's happening is in the highlight areas where that detail wasn't showing up before, we're now creating more shape in the reflection itself. So you can see the bloom layer is a little bit too strong at this point, and I will reduce the effect of that. But for now, I'm just going to keep going because I know that it is on a separate layer, so at any point in time, I can go in and readjust that. Now there's also some areas there where that hue and saturation layer, I'm not really happy with how much of an effect it's having on the scene. So this is where I can select the alpha for that layer, drop the opacity down on my brush a bit lower. I'm just going to make this a bit brighter, and I can paint away where I don't want that effect happening so much. So I'm not trying to completely get rid of it, but I'm trying to bring a little bit more of that red back. So I'm just zooming out here. I'm going to go back into the vignette layer that I set up earlier, and I'm just going to up the intensity of that a bit more. I'm going to make a bigger light, and I'm just going to fade that in around the edges of the character a bit more. Trying to darken off that background. Now what I will do is I'll re-render the background at some point without the extra layers over the top in that composite pass, because I just want a clean background without any of these extra colors. So then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in once again, select the character itself in the alpha. I'm going to make a new layer above that vignette, and I'm just going to fill this with a solid color that matches kind of what's happening on the background here. So just a light aqua blue. What I can do now is I can blur that layer like so. Just make it quite big. And now I can control the density of the layer itself. You can see in 32-bit to nearly remove that and just make it a very subtle glow, you've got to go down really low on the opacity. So I'm at 3% here. But it helps just bring the character off the background a bit. So as I'm working through the render itself, I'm always just zooming in, looking at the different areas in high res. You know, seeing the effect the layers are having. So now what's becoming a little bit too distracting for me is this bloom and glare layer. So that's where you can see where I've got it on a separate layer. I'm going to go into the exposure adjustment I've got set up here, and you can see I made that a bit bright. So as I go down lower on that, now it's not having such a massive effect. And I'm just going to go into the opacity for that layer and just paint away a few areas where I don't really want it coming out over the edges. So I can zoom in on the fingertips here and just paint that away around those areas. You can see there's just like a big streak coming off, which doesn't look very natural. But I still want a little bit of a glow around those. I just don't want that massive halo effect coming off. At this point, you can see I've added in that blue glow behind the character, but one thing that's really lacking is a sense of atmosphere to the scene itself. What I mean by that is right now we're seeing something that looks very crystal clear here, and for a character where you'd see that glow behind, you'd expect the glow or the fog that's kind of that's creating that glow to haze over the top of the character as well. So this is where throughout the course I think I was saying it in lesson 5 part 2 about how in Octane you've got the options to add color profiles to the render itself, and that's where a lot of that realism comes in. So even though right now there's not the ability to do that as well as you can in Octane, it's a key part of the post-production process that I'll go through when making the character look a certain way. So now I'm going to go in and add a color lookup over the top, and I usually experiment with adding a couple of different types, and I just very subtly wash some color through the render itself. So if I go in, you can see there's different types of looks you'll get. Now usually setting this in 32-bit will produce a different look to if you do it to 8-bit, but I'm separating the 32-bit color correction apart from the 8-bit color correction. So once I'm happy with how things are looking in 32-bit, I collapse the image down to 8-bit and then do some final little adjustments there. So I'm just going to go through and experiment with some different looks. So I'm just dropping the intensity down. Every time I find something I think looks good, I'll just, turn it on and off a couple of times. So that could be good because we're adding a bit of that blue atmosphere throughout the scene, but I'll just go through and double check what all of them look like. So for me, it's a toss-up between this teal orange one, the tension green one, and the horror blue one. I'm going to drop the intensity. I think that's just washing out the color a little bit too much. Whereas the teal and orange one really just mixes and blends in nicely with that background. So let me go to 100% here. So you can see when I turn that on now, we're not desaturating the image at all, we're just washing in some of that nice hazy blue through the render itself. So I'm going to add another color lookup at this point, and this time I'll experiment. Rather than using these top LUT files here, you've got different types, so there's some different ones down here that I like to play with. And as sad as it is, sometimes just adding a single color lookup over your render is enough to give things that final realistic push. So I really like the way this is looking, but it's just a bit too strong. So I'm going to drop back on the intensity of that. If I zoom up here, you can see the effect that's having on certain areas, washing out those colors a bit. and giving us once again a bit more shape in the highlights. So it's all subtle little things like that. So you can see the gradient without that on is kind of just going from orange to red. As soon as you introduce that, you get the orange, then you get a little bit more of a washed out red, and then finally the original color we had there. Now things look a bit more nighttime. So I notice now that the character's face is appearing quite dark compared to everything else. And what I can do is I can go into Photoshop and make an exposure layer and just paint that over the character's skin itself. Or you can go into V-Ray, it's totally up to you. And I've got a script enabled here that I'm going to provide in the scene files. So I've just mapped that to F7. It's called Quick Passes. So basically you just select an object in the scene and you just select render with matte enabled and it will spit out an alpha just for the face. But when I'm retouching, I don't always rely on that type of stuff because the adjustment I'm making is too small and too quick anyway. So I'm going to put an exposure adjustment layer over the top here and I'm just going to brighten off. You can see the face. Just adding a bit more intensity to the face. And now I'm going to fill that exposure layer with black and just invert the, now I've got a white selection here and I can paint that in. I'm just going to bring the opacity up all the way. I'll just go to 100% here. See, it makes quite a big difference. Just zoom out. Now it looks like it's sitting in a little bit better, but the problem is I've ruined the saturation a bit by increasing the intensity there. So I'm going to control select that exposure layer I put on and put it here in saturation adjustment over the top. And I'm just going to drop back the saturation. And you can always do little details, like I can keep the red on the lips colorful there by masking that off. Now the skin's reflecting a bit more of that white adjustment. And this is the beauty of working in 32-bit. It keeps the exposure adjustment layers work as if you were retouching over the top of like an HDR file. So this render itself, this 32-bit EXR we're working with, is basically an EXR. So I'll demonstrate that by going down here. And you can see that as I drop down on the exposure, all the bright parts remain visible. And it's a really great way of working by retouching and understanding how to retouch on 32-bit files. So before turning this into an 8-bit file, there's a couple of things I need to do. One of those is go in and make a camera raw adjustment over the 32-bit layer. But before I do that, like I was saying earlier, I needed a new pass for the lights on the visor, of this Dragonfly character, because right now they're not really balanced and it doesn't look too great. So because we're short on time, I'll show you if I go back into the render pass here, you can see I've got a pass just for the head itself. And if I zoom in on that, it kind of looks like this. So in order to get the render looking like that, I've had to go in and make sure there's a couple of lights hitting on the visor edges itself. So I'll go back in HDR Light Studio, and this is where I can just zoom in on the areas I want to light. And I'll just set this up quickly. So this is the beauty of HDR Light Studio, where I can make the lights, you know, exactly the right orientation to hit those areas. This is where going in and adding the custom fall off helps. You know, I can create a rim light on the edge here, and I can also put some color through that. I'm actually going to go into the gradient here. I've just realized I've put the red on the wrong side. And I can duplicate that and change the gradient to blue. And put a rim on the edge. And I'll just turn off the background here. So now I can spit it out in HDR for this pass, go back into 3ds Max, and inside the composite layer, just change that out, re-render the goggles themselves, and you can see that's what I've done here, and it's pinged off the new lights on the goggles themselves. So what I can do here is I can bring that layer inside and take it all the way down to the base where the beauty pass is originally. And now I just want to bring that light in only where the goggles are. So that's where I need a mask for that area. And you can see if I bring this alpha in for the lights, I can just copy paste that, put an alpha adjustment inside the goggle pass, and paste that in. So what I'm going to do now is now that that layer's over the top, I'm going to go into the bloom and glare pass for the headlights for the original render, and I want to get rid of them in that area so that they're not blooming incorrectly. Just being careful where I'm painting this in. And now also, because it doesn't exactly fit here, I want to keep some of the original layer. So this is where I can go into the alpha for the goggles themselves, and I can paint back in some of the original goggles.